Welcome. I'm Jessica Tietjen, and this is the Evolving to Exceptional podcast, where we talk about reaching peak performance in our workplaces, homes, and communities so that we can live our best life possible, an exceptional life. I want to welcome back all of our Evolving to Exceptional listeners. This week, we have a fantastic guest with a lot of expertise in the people and performance and HR industry, Dr. Debbie Regnaud. We're talking about right now a lot of the challenges that people are experiencing with these uncertain times, and particularly how that impacts the nonprofit world and how that insecurity and the challenges that come from not knowing if you're going to have funding or having funding and then not having funding and then having funding again. And all of those changes are impacting people and what we can do about it and why it's so critical to be aware of its impact. But before we get into all of that, I want to give Dr. Regnaud a chance to kind of introduce herself. She is the Vice President of Human Resources right now at Unleashing Potential. And Dr. Regnaud, would you like me to call you that or go by Debbie?
Debbie is good.
Okay, Debbie, introduce yourself to our listeners a little bit. Have them get to know who you are and a little bit about your history and background.
Sure. So I am originally from upstate New York, but I have been in Missouri for a long time. It's been over 20 years. So I moved out here. My first husband and I actually moved out here to start a business. He was an electrical engineer and I was on the operations side. And that is really where I kind of acquired my love and passion for the people side of the business. We had the opportunity to start from scratch. Originally, it was just he and I. Then we hired an employee, then another employee. And so as we grew, it became very clear. And I was, quite young at the time, but I really learned the importance of people and how we treat people and the importance of working collaboratively. And so that kind of sparked my interest and passion for the human resources side of the business. That prompted me to get my degree. I was not in a position as a young person just out of high school to go to college. So it was a little bit later in life that I attended college. So I did manage to get my undergrad and graduate degree in business administration. And then ultimately when my husband and I split, I left the business and then really started focusing just on human resources, a little less on the operations side and more on human resources. So I've held several different positions at the executive level in HR in both manufacturing and in the nonprofit sector. So I spent a little bit of time as a full-time business faculty instructor at ECPI, which is in their online division. I do quite a bit of adjunct teaching. I've taught at Lindenwood. I've taught at York University, University of the People, and I currently still am an adjunct at Webster University as well as ECPI University. And so I spent probably about 3 years, funny enough, during COVID, working from home in this online environment. And after about 3 years, decided I need to get back into the real world and start becoming more of a practitioner, and decided that I was going to focus on the nonprofit sector. And so that ultimately is what led me to my position at Unleashing Potential, which I love. But I can say that there really are some differences and some challenges between the private sector and the nonprofit sector. So it has been a really great learning experience, especially going through it during these difficult times that we're going through right now, as you indicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting, and I want to give you a chance to maybe tell us from your, you have just such a wealth of experience to kind of extrapolate from and to talk about from and share with us from, to help us understand the difference between that private sector or that profit-based business approach to what it's like to be in the nonprofit sector, and what are those kind of differences that you mentioned that you have to be really aware of when you're thinking about it from a people perspective.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's like anything, not all for-profit is the same as a nonprofit. Not all nonprofits are the same, not all for-profits are the same. But I think that from a business perspective, since I'm typically on the executive leadership committee and the leadership team, I'm exposed to the whole business side, not just the HR side, which I feel for human resources is extremely important. I think that's important for HR to have that seat at the table. And so when you have the seat at the table, one thing that I really learned on the nonprofit sector is that it's just it's typically a much more complex financial environment as far as how do you get funding? Because in many cases, it's coming through multiple sources. Some organizations are getting federal grants, some are getting state grants, some are getting both. Some rely heavily just on external funders. Some it's everything and above. So it's a little bit different, I think, from a revenue perspective. In a for-profit, you got your customers. You know who your customers are. It's easier to identify them. I think it's easier to market when you're in a for-profit because you know where you want to target. I think that for-profits, I will say that when I went into the nonprofit sector, I was a little bit naive. And I thought that, especially going into an organization where you're doing good for the community, that's why we go into nonprofit work to help the community and better the lives of maybe individuals that just are underserved and need it. I was a little naive and thought, well, then they've got to have this great effort on the employee side. Because if you feel that way about serving your community, then you've got to have that same attitude about employees. But I think one thing that I've learned is that the employee side hasn't been, and I've had 3 different nonprofit experiences, and they're pretty consistent, that the focus is so much on the mission and so much on the vision and so much on serving the community, which is the whole reason for being, that the employee side is kind of secondary. And what I really find interesting, especially because my background is in manufacturing on the private side for the most part, I would think in a nonprofit environment where your employees are the ones that are really they're the ones that are the front line. They're serving the community. It's even more important to make sure that you've got a good, stable, engaged workforce versus saying a manufacturing. But they're not important because they are, and they can make a huge difference. But that focus, I think, is even more important on the employee side for a nonprofit because typically those are the individuals they're the ones providing the service or facing the client. And if we've got people that are, not engaged or they're stressed or they're experiencing anxiety, it shows, it definitely shows. And I think the other thing is probably the availability of funds. So I think the budgeting process is probably a little bit easier on the private sector because it is a little bit more known. You can more easily project revenue and budget so that you have the opportunity to develop people. It can be a little bit more challenging, especially in a smaller nonprofit, because we're so reactive to what's going on from a revenue perspective. So I think that's the other thing. So there's probably more, but those are the ones that come to my mind right off the bat.
Well, and I think that's interesting, what you said about the focus on people and, when people are in a nonprofit, because the purpose and the impact is so important, typically the pay isn't the same, right, in nonprofit than for-profit world. So you're making a conscious decision when you go to work for a nonprofit. And I could see how it would be, easy to maybe rely more heavily on that decision. And then also the difficulty in deciding to invest in your people, because that's going to, directly take away from maybe funds for serving clients or
Right.
things you might do directly for clients. And so that becomes a much more difficult conversation than when everybody's a customer who's paying and whatever the money comes in is going to be to support the business, the people in the business. It's not necessarily the same. And you talked about earlier, and I mentioned it at the beginning, the uncertain times that we're in right now. And when we talk about that, it has less to do with anybody's particular opinions or perspectives on those times,
Right.
and everything to do with the instability that it creates. The not knowing as to what the market's going to do, as to what the government's going to do, if the government's going to fund something is here in the US, or if it's not going to fund something, or even globally right now, how what one country does is going to impact another country, and then what they're going to have to do in response. And so that global geopolitical environment creates a lot of instability that impacts organizations in different ways. And of course, everyone is impacted, but we talked about how the nonprofit space is even more impacted. So tell me a little bit about how that is, or what that experience is like being on the inside of a nonprofit in the world right now.
Yeah, sure. So, of course, the biggest issue is funding. And if I just take the organization that I'm with, we get I don't remember what percentages is, a pretty high percentage of our revenue comes from state funding. And so we think, okay, well, state funding, that's safe, but the state gets the money from the federal government. So it does trickle through the state ultimately. And so what is happening at the federal level is definitely impacting the money that flows through the state, which then impacts the money that many nonprofits are getting, planning on getting, or hoping to get. And so it becomes just a massive challenge to try and understand not only what is going to potentially happen, but how do you plan for it? And to give you an example, the organization that I work for, we provide early childhood education and after school programming. That's our primary service. And so the federal government has this huge initiative called Head Start, which they fund, which is early childhood education. And we are not, the organization I work for, we are not part of that. We've chosen not to participate in that particular program because of some of the restrictions. But it's a massive number of people that serves across the nation. And a couple of weeks ago, it was rumored that they were going to completely cut that program out. And then additional information came out and it was like, yep, that's definitely up for being cut. And so that was getting a lot of local, I'm sure nationally, I'm sure this was happening, but locally, different organizations that provide those services, they're going into what's my plan B? And then last week, we learned, nope, it's going to be funded. So now those organizations are probably feeling some sense of relief, but can you ever really feel a full sense of relief? Because it could easily the next week go the other way. And then for us, we unexpectedly got word last week that one of our big grants was potentially going to be cut. And then you get into the situation of how do we function without some of these significant grants if they are cut? What is our plan B? And how do you stand? When we got word on this particular grant that was potentially going to be cut, we ask our employees to advocate. We ask our employees to reach out to your congressman and explain why this is so important. And there's a lot of organizations in our industry that even will give the verbiage and all you have and create a website where all you have to do is put in your zip code and it'll do the advocacy for you. So now we have employees that are becoming advocates and fighting for the cause, which is not something that I'm sure many of them expected to do. Certainly I didn't. But knowing that this grant could potentially be cut, now that's created a massive amount of uncertainty within our employee base. Is the agency going to be around? Am I going to have a job? How long am I going to have a job? What am I going to do? And that emanates throughout the whole organization, from the direct care provider that is just working with children and educating them all the way up to the CEO and everywhere in between. We are all now in this constant state of what's going to happen? How do we plan for the future? What do we do? I would say that I've had conversations that literally just before we started talking, I just got off the phone with a colleague talking about what are we going to do? How are we going to handle this? And so that ultimately prompted me to get together with a couple of other individuals and create a local HR nonprofit roundtable so that we could kind of come together from an HR perspective and talk about how are we as nonprofit leaders, what are you experiencing and how are we handling these things? How do we calm our employees down and help minimize their anxiety while we don't have any money to really do any formal programs? So it's been just this constant state of up and down and up and down and up and down.
What do you see in terms of that environment? How do you see people responding or reacting? What are the behaviors? What are the impact other than just the insecurity that comes? What's
Yeah.
the ripple effect maybe of that insecurity and that lack of knowledge of what's going to happen? How does that impact people on a daily basis?
I think the uncertainty really creates, in some cases, a pretty high level of disengagement for sure, because we are all going into our, protecting ourselves mode. What do I do? I just don't know that I'm going to have a job. So people are probably dealing with the dilemma of wanting to commit to the organization and agency because they buy into the mission, they're passionate about what they do, yet also being highly concerned about what their future is. And in some industries, like the industry that I work in, for some of our direct care workers, especially, it's not just the future of what happens with this particular agency, it's the industry as a whole. So they have an even bigger concern. So I think disengagement has got to be the biggest thing that I see. We've been very lucky that our employees have been extremely proactive in terms of reaching out and being an advocate. And I suspect that this is probably pretty consistent among most nonprofits because, as you said, one of the reasons that people don't typically focus on getting jobs in the nonprofit sector because they want to get rich. We usually do it because we are passionate about the mission and it helps us make a personal connection to what we're doing. So it can bring a great deal of value and it can help with going through periods like this. It's a little bit different than, say, uncertainty in a for-profit sector when maybe you lose a big customer. I think people really connect with what's going on right now, and that does help them become a greater advocate as best they can. But they still have those personal challenges and the stress that it creates, the anxiety that it creates, the uncertainty that it creates. And that all is going to result in less engagement for sure. There's no question about that.
Yeah, well, and I think when we think about the impact on the human body from a neurophysiological level, when we're enduring those high levels of stress and repeated exposures to those, we know that without proper processing, that stress gets stored in the body. And as it builds up, our tolerance for stress gets less and less, or our
Yeah.
tolerance for perceived threats. And so what one of the things I've noticed, and one of the things that keeps coming up in my clients and those that I work with is that people are more quick to react. They're
Mm,
more quick to get into conflict. They're more quick to feel threatened by comments or communications that aren't maybe totally clear. We know that in the human body, when the body is under stress like this and when it's constantly shifting into fight, flight, freeze, fawn states and it's regularly experiencing these stressors, that our tolerance for threats gets reduced. And so, whereas in
mhm.
the past we might have been able to respond more consciously or maybe not even perceive something as a threat, in this state of uncertainty and in this state of high levels of stress on a regular basis, we're more likely to perceive things as threats. And then that creates more conflict. It creates more self doubt. So the thoughts of, am I going to be fired? Am I going to be let go? What's going to happen? It creates that rumination. It creates that anxiety. So it actually has like a compounding effect on people. Is that something that you've seen as well in terms of the challenges from people being in this state of kind of instability?
Yeah, I don't have any specific examples, but it certainly makes sense. It certainly makes sense. Yeah. And I can speak from my personal life. I'm in the same boat as many other people in the nonprofit sector that is wondering about my own future. And so, yeah, I can see that I can personally experience that. And I have to really sometimes try and be more self-aware so that I don't react in a negative manner simply because my stress levels are just so high right now. And so things like one of the things that has helped me is having this nonprofit group that so we're like a little support group. We can all share what's going on. We're all in the same boat. Sometimes you just want to know that you're not the only one experiencing these things and it can help. But yeah, I suspect that is probably emanating throughout the organization as well. I can see it in certain individuals. I can see changes in their behavior, and maybe they're a little bit quicker to get to that level where they're, I don't want to say angry, but like, oh, you can just tell that normally they would just let it fluff off, but now it's hitting them in a little different manner. So yeah, that makes total sense.
Well, and in a lot of ways, it hits leaders of organizations even harder, right? Because
Yeah.
they're carrying the load of those decisions. And we see that, I think Gallup's most recent report talked about a significant decline in leader or manager engagement overall. And, the other way that this kind of challenge manifests, or the way that we see it show up, is in a lot of deflection or judgment. And so when there's frustration about the situation or about even about how our people are responding to the situation, we then go into like, why do I have to do this? Like, how come people are this way? And so there's a lot of frustration with the environment, and that's a protective mechanism, right? In order to protect ourselves, we'll look at reasons outside ourselves, like how come they can't be stronger, or how come I have to do all of this that I didn't used to have to do? How come I have to handle people in this way or address these things? Even the topic of engagement, sometimes leaders will feel frustrated with the fact that didn't used to be a thing and now it's a thing they have
Yeah.
to pay attention to, and there's a lot of weight, right, on their shoulders.
Yeah, and I think that some of the things that I've seen is I've seen some of our managers extremely frustrated because their staff are they're more sensitive. They're more quick to ask those questions. And why do I have to do this now? Why can't I get a bigger increase? And why do I have to do this just because you decided to let somebody else go? And they're asking management to justify what they're doing as well. Why don't we have staffing? That was a big one that came up a few weeks ago. And what are you doing about it? Literally had an employee, which is fine because it's all valid and true, send an email out to the top leaders saying, what are you doing about the people? What are you doing about getting good people in here that are going to stay and that are going to be engaged? And this wasn't a manager. This was a direct care worker saying, this impacts me personally in my work. I struggle to do my work and to enjoy my work because we're short staffed. And managers are becoming very frustrated because it's not the 1960s where a manager tells a staff member, this is what you do when you do it and how to do it. It doesn't work that way anymore. So we have to educate and help our leaders, I think, become more able to handle and be okay with having more equal conversations with people. It doesn't bother me, but not all leaders are open to that. There's a lot of people that are still around that have maybe that older approach to management that it just doesn't work anymore. And when you're experiencing times like this, it compounds the behavior of the employee, which then becomes even more frustrating for the manager. And that can create some friction for sure. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's a real indicator that our survival strategies of the past may not be serving us in the present. And that in these situations, our judgment can be another example of being in a survival state. And that we use that to keep ourselves from having to feel our own unprocessed pain or acknowledge our own grief, our own burnout, our own fears. And so, if we don't make space for that as leaders, and I say we because I put
Yeah.
myself in this category for sure, right? This isn't me
Yeah.
pointing fingers at other leaders, but when we carry that burden, and our strategies have been to push through, to persevere, to keep going, to
Yep.
deny, push that feeling down. And, I heard a well known psychologist say recently that pain that's pushed down doesn't ever go away. The only way to make pain go away is to process and feel it fully.
True.
And we're dealing with a lot of pain. That insecurity creates pain. It creates emotion, anger, frustration, exhaustion, overwhelm. Like, it creates impacts. And if we don't have the means, or we don't have the space to process that anger, to process that grief, to process that frustration, and we try to store it, we no longer have capacity for it, right? And
Sure.
so our strategies aren't necessarily serving us. And then that has a ripple effect, right? So if our leaders are struggling, then that's only going to exacerbate the challenge of them having to support people because they don't have capacity. When they're in that
Right.
state, they definitely don't have capacity to be holding space for or giving empathy and compassion to their people or guiding them because they themselves are depleted. And
Right.
so I think it raises a real question as to how do we really support leaders so that they can support their people, so they have capacity to support their people.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. And it kind of goes back to the small nonprofit. It's hard to do that because there's no resources to provide services to our staff, to help further educate our staff. It's just, we're in this constant cycle of, we know we're all struggling. We know we need this help, but the financial side of it is just not allowing us the resources to do anything about it. Is part
Yeah.
of the problem that I see. I had a really good colleague, her and I were talking last week. Her organization's in a similar situation where there's the uncertainty of funding, and first it's going to get cut, then it's not, then this one's going to get cut, and going through exactly what the agency I work for is going through. And her personally, she was talking about how, and she's later in her career, I don't know what to do. I just don't know what to do. What should I do? How long is this going to last? I'm starting to think about my retirement, and I'm starting to think about, this is the later part of my career. I should be making the highest salary, and I should be contributing to my 401k. And I just had to take a pay cut. Now I'm not sure. Now I'm not sure if we're going to have funding, and if I'm going to have a job in 6 months or a year. What do I do? I want to support my organization. I want to be here and help through the transition in hopes that we come out of it. And I want to be there for that. But I'm worried about myself. And what do I do? And my advice to her was to create your plan B. Give yourself a date, give yourself a deadline, and say, okay, by this point, this is what I'm going to do. And if you have to state that you're not going to be with the agency any longer or your organization any longer, then you're given a fair notice. But you got to think of you, because it's not doing anyone any good, including their direct staff, including the organization they work for, if they're ultimately not engaged. And that's what's happening, is we've got leaders that are not engaged because of their own personal challenges and concerns. So for me, having a plan B is super important. It provides me with just a sense of control, I guess, even though we never really know what's going to happen, even in more certain times. I think that's my way personally of dealing with just the what ifs. I think sometimes being proactive, even if you don't really know what the outcome is going to be, but just doing something, taking some sort of positive action. For me, it helps me. And several of my colleagues that I've talked to kind of feel the same way. So I think that's a strategy many of us are using is, okay, we don't know. We need to accept that we don't know. We need to accept that we don't have control over it, and take control over what we can for ourselves. And hopefully that's enough to put us in a position to be more engaged at work and not be so focused on how we're just dealing with it as an individual, because it is a challenge. It's a hard position to be in. And it's especially hard when, as you said, you're not only dealing with your own, how do you be a good leader when you yourself are not in a good place? And then that trickles down throughout the rest of the organization, because people see it, people feel it. behaviors change as a result of it, and not necessarily in a positive way. And so that's, I would love to have resources to help us move forward. But again, that's the challenge. Maybe one of the differences between a for-profit and a nonprofit organization is those resources. They can make a huge difference.
Yeah,
So,
and I think what's interesting too is what I would offer to folks is that there are strategies that we can use that make a big difference but have little to no cost to them. And so some of the things to kind of think about as you talk about this, especially for yourself and others in the nonprofit space, is taking time to regulate our bodies, right? So there's a few ways we can do that. Going outside into nature is one. Taking a walk. So the
yep.
movement, the bipedal movement of walking can help to re-regulate the nervous system. 2.5 minutes of balanced breathing, even breaths in and out, can regulate the nervous system. And if we're feeling ourselves get activated, if we're feeling ourselves in a place of judgment, anxiety, anger, frustration, sadness, shutdown, overwhelm, any of those things, that's a good indicator to say, I need to shift my state. I need to shift my state back into a coherent state. And the more often that we do that, the more frequently that we do that, the more regulated we all become because our systems will co-regulate one another. And so if as leaders we can do that regularly, then we can actually help bring our people back into a regulated state. So that's something that I think is a simple way or a starting point. And then the other thing that you and I talked about in our first call is a sense of awareness. So becoming aware of
Yeah.
what is it I'm really feeling? What is it I'm really experiencing? And actually noticing it. And this part gets weird for some people, but noticing it in your body, because the body holds the tension of what our current experience is. And so even practices as simple as where we notice pain or we notice tension, tightening and relaxing those spaces can help to
Yeah.
release that stored emotion or that stored stress. An emotion is simply energy in motion. It's energy in the body, and it needs to be moved through and out of the body. And so, if you think about, I always go back to when the early days and we were outrunning the saber-toothed tiger, the outrunning of the tiger expelled the stress energy, right? It was the energy in motion. We moved that emotion out of our body. So we need to think about, how do we do that? How do we incorporate those movements, those methods for moving emotion throughout our day? Because so much of our day we're set at a computer and a screen, and we're not necessarily doing practices that would move them out. And then we go home and we sit on screens. So looking at
Yeah.
those types of strategies that aren't high cost, right? They aren't like, you don't have to necessarily invest in anything, but what you do have to do is bring awareness and intention to your daily practices and not stay in your default mode, but instead notice, hey, I'm getting into judgment, or I'm getting into overwhelm, or I'm starting to disengage. What does my body need to get back into a state of presence, engagement, and coherence so that I can move
And
myself through it?
yeah, and that makes total sense. It's like anything though, it's easy to start practice.
Absolutely.
Personally, I do my best to be self-aware and to do many of the things that you talked about, and perhaps sharing those types of strategies for the rest of the organization could be helpful, because not everyone really thinks in those terms. Not everyone thinks about being self-aware. Not everybody thinks about what can I do, what can I do in this moment to calm myself down? So definitely some strategies that could be implemented at no cost, as you said.
I think what's interesting in my work with people and even my own family members is when an issue comes up, if you use the question, so before you ever get into the, well, why do you think that, or what, like any of the cognitive stuff, where do you feel that in your body? Where do you feel that? And it's really interesting how people will go, and then they suddenly notice, and it's, maybe it's my chest or my arms or my gut or wherever. I feel it here, I feel it in my throat. And it's even just asking that question puts people back in their bodies. It has them paying attention to what they're feeling in their
Mm-hmm.
body. and it allows them to start to move. But I think you made a really important point, which is on our own, it's really hard. It's really hard on our own. And so to have partners, to
Yeah.
have people around us that can ask that question and know enough to ask that question is really powerful, right? And so it can feel weird the first time you ask it, right? It certainly did for me. And also, it's really powerful for people because we know that 80% of the communications in the body come up from the body to the head and only 20% come down. And so all the head-based strategies of why do you feel that way, or how could you think about it differently, or all those things can only do so much. And the body can do so much more if we allow it to, right? If we bring it into the conversation. And so it's not like you're diagnosing anything, you're just saying, where do you notice it? And that brings them back to their body, and it
Yeah.
brings a sense of awareness to what it is they're experiencing.
It's interesting that having someone else to have these conversations with, because one of the things that I was thinking of is, wouldn't it be great to have an environment where we can ask each other those questions, where your coworker is asking you those questions, and it's not just you dealing with it on your own. That I can see how that could be very beneficial, especially people that work together closely, and they might recognize changes in behavior in the other person more easily than others might. That could be a great opportunity to ask those questions. Yeah, that's a great
Well,
point.
and it shifts some of the
Yeah.
responsibility off the manager too, right? When you equip people, all people, with the
Yeah.
ability to partner with one another, because the manager can't, leaders, managers, we can't be everywhere all the time. And in fact, it's impossible
Right.
because we're executing and we're trying to support people, and it's really hard. And so the more you can equip everybody with some of these skill sets on how to partner with each other, how to support one another, how to ask the right questions when situations come up, the better the results are. Because it's, instead of hiring a bunch of outside coaches or consultants or experts to come in
Mhm.
and support everybody, let's give everybody inside those tools and those abilities so that they can support one another, because they're in it every day with each other, right? They're in it when the crisis
Right.
strikes or the big challenge happens, and you can turn to your coworker and go, I am so overwhelmed right now. I want to cry, or whatever it is you're feeling. And they'll be able to be equipped to say, okay, let's go for a walk and talk about that. Let's get that overwhelm out of your body.
Right.
Let's breathe together for a minute, or that allows you to process through and move some of those things.
I love that idea. Implementing it might be a little challenging, but it's doable.
Yeah.
It's a great idea. Yeah. I like that.
So tell me, based on your current experience and what you've encountered, what you see as where things are going in terms of people and these challenges. Where do you see the next steps in terms of dealing with this new world we've created for ourselves?
Well, that's a great question. I do, I think that, I do think that there needs to be more of a real genuine focus on mental health for employees, more so than ever. I know there's a lot of, in the HR world, you hear about wellness programs, and many of them don't really provide, I think, the tools, kind of like you were just talking about, real tools to help people maneuver through these challenging times. A lot of those programs can be much more surface level, and I think that they need tools. They need to know, first of all, it's okay that you feel the way you do and you're not alone. And there are ways to feel better about yourself and to feel better emotionally and mentally and physically, because as you said, it gets into the body and we feel it in our body. So I would see a greater need for mental health tools being extremely valuable to employees, for sure. More so than ever. Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't know what they are, and I don't have the answers, but I see that really being important. And I think that especially we got multiple generations that are in our workforces, and the older crew is slowly moving through the retirement phase and into the next phase of their lives. And we are left with more individuals that are open to talking about how they feel mentally and are more open to, this is my opinion, but are more open to taking tools that might be provided and helping them and using them to better themselves and improve themselves. So I don't know that 30 years ago that would have worked, because I think culturally we were in a different mindset regarding especially mental health. But I think now people would be much more open, and especially, I mean, we wasn't that long ago we experienced COVID, and now we're experiencing some of these other challenges of uncertainty. And it's been a really hard, I don't think a day goes by at work that I don't have a conversation with someone about what is going on. We thought it would be over with COVID, and now we have these other uncertainties that we're dealing with. What is going on? And it's kind of a double whammy. So I think mental health is a really important factor in helping provide tools to people that might not even be in a position to get them otherwise. So
Well, and I think you raise an important point that just because we didn't need them before doesn't mean that we don't need them now. And so 30 years ago was a totally different world in terms of the rate at which things were happening, the technology that we were exposed to, how quickly things were changing. There were so many things that were different then. We spent a lot more time outside in
yeah,
nature, a lot less time on screens because we didn't have them. And
right.
so it
Yep.
was just a different experience that we were having. And I think what you're seeing with the newest generation is being born into the world as it exists with all of this technology and all of this
Yeah.
fast change and all of this fast movement. One of the things I always like to emphasize is nothing is an indication that anyone is broken or needs to be fixed or not good enough or any of those things. But what we're seeing is that our human body hasn't adapted for the world in which we're living. And so our human body wasn't built for a world with so much rapid change, so much information overload. Like it just wasn't, our brains and body weren't built for this. And so we have to look at how do we provide those tools, like you talked about, those resources, so that people can develop the capacity to do that. They can develop the ability to adapt more quickly. And if we're constantly in states of survival and we're never regulating our bodies, then we're not going to adapt because we're in those survival states. So I think what comes with time in this area is discovering that we need deeper, more profound support than we've needed before. And that's reflective of the world that we're in today.
I agree 100% with that. Yep.
I so appreciate this conversation. I think this has been fantastic. And I appreciate you kind of bringing the awareness to the space of nonprofit in particular because of some of the unique challenges that you experience there and how to maybe look at those and address those and navigate them in the world that we're in today. Before we wrap up here, I'd love to give you a chance to give a final thought, final insight, something you want to share with our audience as we wrap up.
Oh, goodness. I think for me, probably the most important thing is to not undervalue the power of self-awareness. Because if we're not self-aware, even if we have all these tools that we just talked about having, we're not going to use them. So learning how to be more self-aware, taking advantage of just the few tools that you discussed in our conversation here can have a huge impact on how we feel emotionally, mentally, physically. So self-awareness is, to me, where much of it starts. Much of your self-help starts with your self-awareness. So,
100%.
and if we can help our employees get there, we're going to have more engaged employees, happier employees, and a better culture. Yeah.
Totally. I think that advice to all of our listeners, I would take that and hold on to it because I think you're right. I don't think there's anything more important because we can't do anything about something if we're not aware of it, if we don't bring our consciousness to it and pay attention to it. So I want
Right.
to thank you, Debbie, for coming on, for sharing all of this wisdom with us. To our listeners, I want to just kind of close with this thought around self-awareness. and share just a little bit in terms of my own journey around this and how I spent, after I burned out, so long sick and repeatedly finding myself getting sick, dealing with autoimmune conditions, until I could bring awareness to the challenges and the issues and the things that I had ignored, suppressed, denied, stuffed down inside. And once I brought awareness to those, then I could start to bring the coherence. Then I could start to bring the regulation and those strategies of balance back in. And as I've done that, I've seen the effects. I've seen how much healthier, how much happier, how much better I'm able to navigate a world that is constantly changing and always stressful. And so I encourage you, if you haven't before, to look at how you can get some of these skill sets, how you can look at creating greater self-awareness and acquiring some of these tools so that you can navigate the stressful world that we're in a better way, rather than medicating it, suppressing it, using social media or other devices to distract us from it. And so I encourage you to take this time and take this opportunity to really focus on what you can do inside to evolve yourself. And as always, I like to remind you to just keep evolving, keep growing, keep rewiring those neural pathways so you can live your best life, an exceptional life. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be back again next week with another episode.